This is it, night 6 of protests in downtown Denver. Sky 9 is flying over the Capitol, which has been the epicenter each day and night. The protests following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis started late last week in this city and have gone on each day and night ever since. 9 o'clock marks the start of Denver's curfew, which police have made clear only really applies to protesters in the street. They're not scouring neighborhoods for people who are out walking their dogs. Last night, we watched them not enforce that curfew in any real way for hour after hour, allowing a peaceful assemblage to continue. That curfew runs overnights through Friday morning.
And today, the families of several people killed by police in Colorado joined the protesters on the steps of the state capitol. They asked the hundreds gathered to remember their loved ones, too.
Democratic representatives from the state legislature announced a new police accountability bill right there on the steps to the protesters. 9 News reporter Mark Salinger spoke with the families and joins us now. Mark, what are we seeing tonight as the curfew strikes at 9?
Yeah, Kyle, I want to paint the scene for you right now. There are thousands of people here behind me at the state capitol, much more than we saw last night at this time. Throughout the day, thousands of people have been marching all throughout the streets of Denver, finally ending up here. Now that the clock has struck 9 p.m., they're yelling some obscenities about the curfews. There's no sign that they're going to go home anytime soon. This wasn't the case. This wasn't like this the entire day. It has been peaceful throughout the entire day. Earlier today, and it still is peaceful right now, but earlier today, we have seen and we heard from the families of some people who were killed by police, and they want the protesters to remember their names as well.
On the 6th day of protests, the names of those killed in Colorado united protesters at the state capitol.
He died in Denver City Jail in 2015.
Natalia Marshall is the niece of Michael Marshall, who died in police custody 5 years ago. The city settled the case with the family, and the 6 deputies involved were never prosecuted.
When I see all these people in support, it's a blessing. It's a true blessing. It's a beautiful sight to see, because I actually feel like maybe they really hear us. Maybe they hear us.
Today, she spoke about her uncle to a crowd protesting the death of George Floyd.
My message to the protesters, the peaceful protesters, is thank you. And I'm here to say, Black Lives Matter!
The families of 3 black men killed by police in Colorado joined Democratic state lawmakers as they announced a new bill they say will increase police accountability. They say it's designed to increase transparency to police actions across Colorado.
We will, once and for all, strip the immunity that law enforcement has when they kill us.
Representative Leslie Herod says the bill would, among other things, appoint the state attorney general to investigate all instances where someone died at the hands of law enforcement. It would also allow for law enforcement officers who have acted improperly to be sued by eliminating a shield of immunity, as well as require police across the state to wear body cameras.
I hope these police officers are held accountable. It's not fair that the mayor will call these people murderers, but they still go home to their families.
A step Natalia Marshall feels helps address the issue, bringing everyone together today.
I think finally, it's sad to say, but I think finally.
We reached out to the state Republican Party to hear their response on the bill, but did not hear back. Again, back out live here at the Capitol, I want to paint the scene a little bit more for you. There are fireworks going off in the sky right now as the protest that has been peaceful throughout the entire day, peaceful marching throughout all of Denver, now goes on past the curfew. We haven't seen any police officers here. We'll see if that changes later on tonight. Kyle.
We'll keep track of things and we'll be talking to you more in just a bit. Denver Mayor Michael Hancock's spokeswoman is walking back something striking that the mayor said late last week on our air. Mayor Hancock has been quick to call the killing of George Floyd a murder. That is something that Mayor Hancock has not said when Denver officers have been involved in controversial use of force deaths. That is until last Friday, when he made the comment that his office is now trying to backtrack on. I asked him whether the deaths of Michael Marshall, who you just heard referenced, and Marvin Booker and Jesse Hernandez in Denver, whether those cases were also murder.
Those individuals were yes, murdered by police officers.
4 days later, the mayor's office says Mayor Hancock meant to say that they were killed by law enforcement and did not mean murder in the legal sense. We reached out to see if the mayor would also no longer call George Floyd's death a murder. We've not received an answer from the mayor's office on that.
His caption said, "Let's start a riot." Today, Denver police gave that officer the boot. Officer Thomas McClay was fired after posting a controversial picture with 2 other Denver officers in riot gear. Denver's police chief only announced he was launching an investigation today. So the action was swift. 9 News reporter Jordan Chavez has been looking into this while following today's protesters through downtown. And Jordan, an unusual turnaround for Denver police.
Extremely fast, Kim. We actually had the opportunity to speak to a professor at CU Denver who has done extensive research on police accountability, and he tells us that this is actually becoming a trend across the U.S. What we saw today, that police chiefs are starting to act very, very quickly when it comes to complaints of misconduct, much like we saw with Officer Thomas McClay, who DPD says violated their social media policy. Now, we looked through the department's codes of conduct, and it specifically addresses these kinds of posts, saying posting images or statements that ridicule any race or protected class of people is prohibited.
Most of the time and historically, police departments have gone through a fairly comprehensive investigative process, and where there are police unions and there are police protections in place, sometimes that can extend for a long period of time. So I think this trend of very quickly acting on issues is fairly new.
Now, what Professor Paul Taylor warns, though, is that we also need to be very careful that being quick to fire someone who breaks the rules doesn't replace the department actually making sure that it's keeping its entire system in check. That is exactly what we have seen from these protesters on their signs. That's the message they also want to make sure that stays at the forefront as we marched with them and followed them down the streets all through downtown, past Coors Field, past Union Station, down 16th Street Mall, back to here. Kim, it was about 2 hours. We made it about 4.5 miles. It was a very long time with these people who had a very clear message, Kim.
Yeah, they're making their voices heard, and we hear the fireworks again right now, right on cue at 9 o'clock or a few minutes after. Thank you, Jordan.
For the first time today, Democratic Governor Jared Polis spoke to reporters about the protests that have been going on in Colorado since last Thursday. He criticized President Trump's plan to deploy U.S. troops to American cities.
The president's threat to deploy federal troops is counterproductive, would only stoke the potential for worse violence and destruction. And I fear shows that he's become so isolated in the White House, in the ivory tower, that he doesn't understand what's really going on our streets.
Governor said that he chose to remain silent through the weekend of protests because he's been spending the time listening to faith and community leaders. Governor Polis did call George Floyd's death a murder, said it was part of a pattern of injustice.
History is part of their name. Now they say they're experiencing it in real time.
In spite of the cloud cover, close to 90 degrees in the city again, tracking isolated severe storms tonight. That radar update is next.
Sky 9 is still over the protests 6 days in a row, 6 nights in a row in Denver. Capitol is the center of the focus. Last night, many of the crowds marched through the streets around the area and wound up back at the Capitol past the curfew, which is at 9 p.m. And we expect they will be there tonight. They are still there. It's still peaceful. Police are present. They haven't necessarily felt their presence. It'd be fair to say at this point, they're keeping an eye on things. Curfew is from 9 to 5 a.m. It is set to expire on Friday morning at 5 a.m. Denver police say they are looking into an incident that happened in downtown Denver tonight. It happened at 14th and Broadway about 5:30. The video shows a driver getting out of his truck and arguing with the protesters crossing the street. You then see the driver get back into the truck and start driving into the crowd in the crosswalk. Witnesses say no one was hurt. Police tell us they are monitoring Twitter and they are investigating.
We saw more protests across the country today. Most of them remained peaceful. In Washington, D.C., police and National Guard lined the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Protesters marched there and held a memorial. It was yesterday that officers swept down on a group of peaceful protesters outside the White House in order to clear the way for the president to walk to a church for a photo op holding a Bible in the air. A day after violent protests in Seattle, things so far calm in that city tonight. Members of their symphony and opera marched with protesters. Before the protests in Seattle started today, parts of downtown were practically empty, save for police and National Guard. Businesses had boarded up their windows and closed up shop.
We are witnessing history in real time, and that's why researchers at History Colorado are documenting the current civil unrest in our state, even as their own building is vandalized. Here's the perspective of their CEO, visualized by photojournalist Travis Cacciatorian.
We often are saying, it's almost cliche right now, these are unprecedented times.
An emergency curfew order is in place in the city of Denver from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! So History Colorado has, some broken windows. We've got graffiti, a number of things like that around our building. It's since been cleaned up and boarded up, but that's the kind of damage we sustained over the last few nights over the weekend. We don't love being a part of the history, so to speak. We're definitely more recorders of history and interpreters and researchers of history, but we know we can't look at the damage to our building in a vacuum. We know it is part of a much larger story that we all share together.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
You can look at a number of episodes throughout our history to see ways in which people have expanded civil rights, expanded liberties, and it often comes down to times of struggle.
If you refuse to comply, you are subject to immediate arrest.
We're very actively collecting, and we hope collaborating with the community to add to our collection so that we can really tell a very full story of this episode of Colorado history.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, those are amazing pictures. And the story continues to unfold tonight, and we'll continue to cover that. In the meantime, for June, our weather, relatively calm and quiet. June is our severe weather month, and only isolated severe storms on the radar tonight. Enough cloud cover around to make it interesting. At dusk and at dawn, beautiful color in the sky today. We did enjoy seeing these scenes coming in up and down the Front Range. The cloud cover we thought might keep temperatures down a bit, but 89 in Denver today. The average is 77, 100 in Lamar, 94 in Grand Junction, and 79 in the Steamboat area. We do have a few clouds over the downtown skyline, and right now winds remain light out of the east, humidity coming up a bit here in the backyard outside the studios, kind of mild and muggy, close to 70 this 9 o'clock hour. We are kind of tracking this cool front which swept across northeastern Colorado. Out ahead of it, sparking a line of convection that did produce some rotating thunderstorms. We had a line of land spouts that developed out in Kit Carson Carson County and out near the Cheyenne Wells area out toward Burlington. And now we're seeing those storms migrating toward the North Platte area where we're getting some large hail reports and some heavy flooding rainfall with some flash flooding issues east of Burlington tonight. A cluster of storms moving through the Weld County area, and that cell did go severe as well. The low stays in the Midwest. The front drops in and we've got all this moisture rotating around the backside of this dominant ridge of high pressure. So tomorrow's Storm Prediction Center has this area from Rapid City to North Platte out toward the St. Louis and Cincinnati areas for hail producing thunderstorms. That's extreme northeastern Colorado and does not include Denver. Temperatures tomorrow will run above average again in the mid 80s with lots of sunshine. We do see these isolated cells moving out tonight. Skies will clear. We get a mostly sunny start to the day. Less cloud cover tomorrow, but enough moisture in the atmosphere that with heating of the day, we may see 1 or 2 thunderstorms develop from Fort Morgan down to Lyman and then progress into Nebraska and Kansas where they may turn severe. Lows tonight will be mild. This morning our low at 63 was a record warm minimum temperature for the day, so it'll be a few degrees cooler, a little better sleeping weather temperature wise there. But we're back in the mid to upper 80s for northeastern Colorado tomorrow, some 90s down south, 70s in the mountains and close to 90 across the western slope. Pine Junction at 80, Golden at 84 tomorrow. Arvada, Boulder, you guys will be pretty close to 90 degrees if we can get more sunshine than cloud cover like you saw today. These isolated storms are moving out, clearing, and 59 degrees will be your low this evening. Tomorrow we've got sunshine, 71 at 9 o'clock. We'll be in the mid 80s by about 3 o'clock. 20% chance of a late day storm coming off the foothills both Wednesday and Thursday. A better chance of rain from storms with a stronger system moving our way Friday. 90s for the weekend, and there are no big organized storm systems coming in to bring a big rain event. And rain is so welcome, but sometimes with these thunderstorms you get amazing clouds, and look close, a glorious rainbow there right in the center of the screen. And the pictures of the spring flowers are tremendous as well. Keep them coming. We want to hear from you. We love the pictures and weather reports. We're going to take a break right now, but we'll be back. We hope you will be too.
Protesters continue to march through the streets of Denver tonight, the 6th day of protests in our city in response to the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last Monday. Some things of note tonight. This group of protesters is at 16th and Lincoln. Anytime somebody runs, we always kind of look to see what that's about, but I don't see any issues there. They're 16th and Lincoln, which means that they are farther north than they were allowed on Saturday. That was the day of the big clash with police, when riot police formed a line at Colfax and would not allow anybody close to the business district. Also, last night you heard the police chief, Paul Pazin, offer shifting rationales for when they might use force against peaceful protesters after curfew, telling us at 9 o'clock last night they would not use force and move in on peaceful protesters after curfew, and then at 10 o'clock saying, well, they would use discretion and good judgment. Jordan Chavez and Brian Wendland are giving us this picture, our crew walking near some of the protest groups in downtown tonight.
We are now, of course, making sure that we go about something close to our lives, our normal lives, in a way that isn't necessarily normal. We're in this for the long haul. We need to live the safe, sustainable way to live with COVID-19 in our lives without having another spike that would overrun our hospital system.
Pools and playgrounds can slowly reopen in our state. Churches can invite more people in, and short-term rentals can reopen, all within the limits, of course. Democratic Governor Jared Polis gave us an update on the state's safer at home and in the vast great outdoors order today. It's a mouthful. A draft of guidelines from the state says that organized sports can resume with a max of 25 people outside or 10 inside, and pools, playgrounds, tennis courts, and basketball courts, they can open with limited capacity. Short-term rentals have to provide cleaning supplies or take anything out that can't be cleaned. The governor also encouraged everyone who joined a protest this weekend to get tested for COVID-19, even if you don't have symptoms. Denver is also expanding its testing. All essential workers and anyone who is asymptomatic and thinks that they were exposed can get free testing at the Pepsi Center. Testing numbers were up last week. Still short of the 10,000, though, daily test goal listed by the governor.
Chances are that you or somebody you know got sick in the last few months and wondered, did I have COVID? Did she have COVID? Did he have COVID? Thousands of tests later, we're getting a much better idea of precisely what the virus has already done. 9 News reporter Chris Vanderveen, along with the help of one of our colleagues, explains.
That half of a head belongs to 9 News photojournalist Anna Hewson. Picture taken March 24th, the morning she went to an ER feeling terrible. Doctors didn't admit her, but they did suggest her cough, fever, and fatigue were the result of an unknown virus. She was not tested, thanks to a massive and national shortage of COVID tests at the time. Long since recovered, Anna this month decided maybe it was time to see if COVID was responsible for her bad illness. That's her son on camera duty. She turned to National Jewish and put down $89 for an antibody test.
All of our testing is done in-house.
Dr. David Buther says Anna's curiosity is quite common these days.
Everybody seems to want to tell themselves a story that symptom that they had, that virus, the shortness of breath, that cough that they had in March or April, maybe I had a mild case of COVID-19.
Antibody tests are different from the PCR tests you likely know well. Swab, nose, yep. PCR tests tell you if you have the virus.
The PCR testing is, am I sick right now? Am I infectious right now?
Serology, or antibody tests, look for, you guessed it, antibodies, which tell you if you had the virus.
The antibody test is saying, was I sick in the past?
An important distinction because people with antibodies are likely to have some immunity from the virus moving forward. Speaking of moving forward, last week Anna drove to a drive-up testing site run by National Jewish.
Hi, here for testing.
We asked for no favors, no free tests. We only asked to record what the process looks like.
Do you want me to hold your paperwork?
The line eventually leads to a trailer and a needle and a blood draw we won't show you because ick.
We send that off to our labs,
where they test
dozens and dozens of samples at one time.
These tests not only provide an insight to Anna, they provide an insight as to how much the virus has already spread. And so far, the results are telling people like Dr. Buther one thing.
It really has only been a very small percentage, single-digit percentage, how many people have already had this in Colorado.
Of the first 45,565 antibody tests reported to the state health department in May, Only 7.3% turned up positive. Keep in mind, this is not a random sample. Most involved people like Anna who had gotten sick in the months prior, people who had reason to think they might have had it. The day after the hospital tested Anna's blood,
View test results.
Anna joined a long list of people
Results not detected.
with a negative antibody test result.
Nope.
We're bursting a lot of bubbles here, but that's important. That's important for people to know that they're still vulnerable.
Still vulnerable to a virus she and countless others thought they almost certainly had. A virus that has granted immunity to far too few to render most of us safe. Chris Vanderveen, 9 News.
National Jewish told us that when it's testing for a very specific antibody, it's getting almost 100% accurate results. That is not always the case with a lot of antibody tests. The FDA has warned that many of them are just simply not very good. Something to keep in mind.
You've all heard of cats hiding in cars, right? Well, this is one big cat. A mountain lion made itself at home in a car in Longmont. They're commonly seen west of there in Boulder and in Lyons. Longmont police say most wild animals will eventually leave residential areas when left alone. Apparently this guy wasn't having it, thought he was really alone. Colorado Parks and Wildlife got him out and relocated him to the Arapahoe National Forest. So it all worked out. That's going to do it for the first half hour. We'll have updates from tonight's protests and the state's continued response to COVID-19, all coming up at 9:30. Stay with us.
Peaceful and passionate protesters are on the move in Denver tonight, a sixth straight night. Of course, I say on the move because I assume they were still moving. They've now stopped, which makes me look tremendously foolish. They are at 20th and Champa, so they are basically east, maybe a little northeast of the downtown area, and they have decided to stop in the street. What we saw in the first few nights of protests is that a situation like this, when protesters would take a public space like this and hold it for a while, is that police would move in quickly and aggressively with tear gas or other measures to move them. That's not what we saw last night. Appears to be a different situation. 9 News reporter Jordan Chavez is down there along with photojournalist Brian Wendland. And any officers to be seen from where you guys are?
Kyle, the only officers that we're really seeing are the ones that are kind of a block away from where everybody that's marching right now is. They're really the ones that are just kind of blocking off the streets, making sure that no traffic gets onto the roads where everybody is walking. We were actually wondering kind of how, if they had a plan or anything like that. Sorry, we were trying to watch the expletives as people walk by. We are actually seeing them move from intersection to intersection as they watch the crowds of people advance. We are at the tail end of it. That's for safety reasons on our end. And so you can kind of see, I'm going to step out of the way, let Brian zoom in on the very large crowd that has just walked by. We are standing at Welton and 20th. And when you say that, they're kind of stopping, they're doing that every so often, but then they will quickly continue again. And remember, Kyle, that image yesterday where people were silently kneeling for that nearly 9 minutes as a representation of how long George Floyd was held on the ground. We are seeing a very different image tonight. This time when they kneel, they are very loud. It is not that quiet statement anymore. It is a very loud statement, as they often will chant to get out of your homes and onto the streets, calling people to come out of their apartments and join their movement. They want to be loud. They want to make sure that they are heard. But again, it has been very peaceful. Police have seemed to leave them alone to this point and honestly just kind of block the roads for them, Kyle.
It's really interesting to hear, Jordan, that they're calling on people to come out of their homes and protest, because we've seen that in other cities around the country. We've even seen instances where protesters in other cities have called out to officers on the line and said, come march with us, walk with us.
Exactly. That was something that we saw yesterday as far as police go. Today, that has not been the case. They've solely been just kind of standing there again to block the way. I really haven't seen this work as people call out and tell people to come join them. Most people just kind of tend to stand on their balconies or on the roofs of their building watching as they go by, but they certainly are joining that chant with them and kind of letting them know that they stand with what they are marching for. Kyle.
All right, another night. Americans expressing their views in downtown Denver. Jordan, you and Brian, stay safe. We'll talk to you soon.
Around the country, local officials have suggested that outsiders fed the public unrest that followed peaceful protests over the death of George Floyd. But Kevin Vaughn from our 9 Wants to Know team dug into the recent arrests here and found that Coloradans dominated the police reports.
We have individuals, including last night, who are arrested for arson, who are arrested for burglary, who are arrested for creating mischief.
On Saturday, as Denver Police Chief Paul Pazin tried to get his arms around the violent clashes in his city,
we certainly have folks that are coming from outside the metro area in order to further this type of destructive and violent behavior.
He embraced the idea that people from other communities were to blame and promised a crackdown.
We will investigate, follow up, and hold people accountable for the laws that they violate in our community.
And Denver police have done that. 338 arrests so far in 5 nights of trouble. But a 9 Wants to Know analysis found at least 71% of those busted were from Colorado, and the biggest percentage of them were from Denver itself. The vast majority, 290, were accused of minor offenses, like violating curfew or disobeying police. Another 11 were juveniles, and we don't know what they're accused of. But 37 others face more serious charges, including carrying weapons, throwing missiles, assault, and arson. At least 16 of those 37 were from Denver, and another 15 were from other nearby communities, leaving only 6 outsiders. Of course, it's harder to know the hometowns of everyone in the giant crowds filling downtown Denver during the past week, but a majority of the people arrested for causing the worst trouble are right at home. Kevin Vaughn, 9 News.
And there are a number of people who have been arrested that we haven't been able to determine a current address for.
Denver City Council and community activists want a clear explanation for when Denver police officers will use force against protesters. Last night, Police Chief Paul Pazin told us live on the air at 9 o'clock that officers would not use force against protesters who were out and being peaceful after curfew. An hour later, live on our 10 o'clock newscast, the police chief said that officers would instead use their discretion and good judgment before using force against peaceful protesters. Activist Elizabeth Epps says officers used neither. She helped to write the rules outlining use of force. She resigned from that committee today, saying that she had been shot with pepper balls and projectiles while out during the protests. Epps wants a review of the entire police department.
Okay. If your discretion says, you know, there's 3,000 people over here, 4 of them threw a water bottle, let's gas the 3,000 people, you're in the wrong line of work. I'm so embarrassed that I expected better, but I did.
Chief Pazin says Internal Affairs will investigate the actions of some officers. City Council wants the chief and the director of safety to testify before a council committee to discuss the use of force. Councilman Paul Cashman also wants the city's independent monitor to review DPD's policies. Activist and Denver School Board member Tay Anderson, who we saw out leading some of the daytime protests, wants to take Denver police officers out of Denver schools. He said he'll work with School Board Vice President Jennifer Bacon on a resolution which would end the contract between DPS and the city schools, or DPS rather, and the city. Anderson said that he wants nurses and counselors instead of police officers functioning as school resource officers. Anderson says that he and Superintendent Susana Cordova will share more details Friday morning.
Colorado's testing numbers took a dive, but the state still has some other good news in its fight against COVID-19. Plus, more coverage of tonight's protest. This is the crowd that is far north of the Capitol, stopped at 20th and Champa tonight. It appears that the protesters are sitting in the street. Again, Denver's curfew started at 9 p.m. We'll be right back. The number of COVID-19 hospitalizations in Colorado continues to go down. Just 268 people remain in the hospital. That's the lowest number since late March. And there were only 15 new hospital admissions in the past 2 days. State testing numbers, though, did take a dive. Fewer than 3,500 tests were processed on Monday. And last week, the number of processed tests, well, that was approaching near 8,000.
Usually when you hear the word historic in a newscast, there's a decent chance that the person talking to you is being a bit hyperbolic. But not this time. What has happened with unemployment in America is absolutely historic. We'll allow Chris Vanderveen and our colleagues at the Tegna Design Tank to explain.
Out of luck and out of work. For millions, the Great Depression no longer seems like a bygone era. In 10 weeks, 40.7 million Americans have filed jobless claims. That's more claims filed in the previous 178 weeks combined. Think of it this way. If you took every man, woman, and child living in New York City, LA, and Dallas and multiplied them not by 2, but by 3, you'd have about the same number of people who have filed claims since the start of this. Ever since the days of World War II, U.S. unemployment has risen and dropped slowly, gradually, revealing recessions, periodic descents followed by ascents, not one of which touched double digits until April, when the U.S. recorded the largest one-month percentage increase in our history. A shock to the American economic system, a shock felt so acutely over such a short period of time that Congress decided it was simply too much for too many to handle. Before all this, the average weekly unemployment insurance benefit was around $388, 40% of what the unemployed on average earned before they lost their jobs. In March, Congress agreed to add $600 to make weekly payments roughly the same amount the average worker made pre-pandemic. Basically, what he or she earned before, they receive now via the government. Problem is, state unemployment programs are running out of money quickly. At least 9 states have already reached insolvency and have asked to borrow money from the feds to backfill their own funds. More will follow. Come the end of July, that $600 bump in payment is, as of now, set to expire, leaving tens of millions with an unenviable conundrum. Try to find a job in a market filled with tens of millions of new and desperate competitors, or settle in for a summer unlike any we've seen since the days of a depression most of us alive today have only experienced within the pages of a history book.
A new phase of reopening that Colorado will allow swimming pools to open with restrictions. Crowds would be limited to 50 people or 50% capacity, depending on which is lower. Groups would have to stay 6 feet apart. The state wants pools to set up a reservation system to limit overcrowding and give pool workers time to clean between groups. Some pool managers we spoke with today say they're not sure they can reopen. The crowd limits make it just impractical. The state also released guidelines for houses of worship that could limit crowds. People can offer their feedback through tomorrow, and then the state will release finalized guidelines later this week. We'll be right back.
The Broncos held a team meeting for more than 90 minutes today to talk about all that's gone on in our country over the past week. Joe Ellis, the team president, led those discussions. No more discrimination or room for racism. Plus, the Broncos believe that they can be a part of the healing process, something Kareem Jackson, their safety, talked about this afternoon.
We have to figure out what we can do, not only as a team, but as a organization. How can we get out and how can we impact the Denver community? You know, how can maybe we can get out and put together a march as a team or something like that. I feel like we have to get out in the community and be heard, you know, just with the opportunities that we have, you know, as professional athletes.
The NFL told teams today that they must practice at their own facilities for training camp. Now, the Broncos practice at their own place anyways, but this news does still affect them. It means that those preseason practices, those joint practices for the Bears they had planned, will not happen. Move now to the NBA, and the league lost a legend today. Wes Unseld passed away this morning at the age of 74. The Hall of Famer has had health issues, most recently pneumonia. Wes Unseld Jr., Wes's son, is a current member, an assistant coach with the Nuggets. Denver president of basketball operations, Tim Conley, tweeted out, "As great a player as Wes was, he was a better person. He made such an incredible impact on so many people. We are thinking of Mrs. Connie, Kim, and Wes Jr. The world has lost a special guy today." Finally, the NBA Board of Governors has a Thursday meeting to set a vote to finalize the plan to restart their season. A likely model, a 22-team format, that is, in Orlando, with things tipping off on July 31st. The finals would end by October 12th. Stay with us. 9 News returns right after this.
Protesters in downtown Denver have moved onto Broadway, and they are again on the move after a striking display of silence witnessed by our Jordan Chavez. Jordan?
Kyle, things progress very quickly here. 1 minute, they are kneeling for 8 minutes and 40 seconds, representing the time that George Floyd was held to the ground. The next minute, loud cheers and a lot of honking erupts. And then they are once again on the move. Like you said, we are heading down actually 19th. We're at the intersection with California. Still a lot of honking, a lot of protesters here. One new thing that we have started hearing that we did not hear earlier today since the curfew kicked in was that they're yelling, they want justice, and then expletive, your curfew. I'll let you fill in the blank here. I'm gonna ask Brian to turn around just really quickly because I want to give you an example of what you were asking earlier, Kyle. Here are the cops that we were pointing out earlier. Again, they're really just following up and making sure to block off the road so these people that are protesting are safe, Kyle.
Really more of a courtesy patrol than anything else is what it looks like. All right. We hope for a quiet and calm night for all parties involved in downtown Denver. Our coverage of the 6th consecutive night of protests, the death of George Floyd, continues on 9 News at 10 over on Channel 9. A 6th night of protest draws hundreds, if not thousands, to Denver as things remain peaceful and passionate.
If they can't carry a weapon, they can't be a law enforcement officer in Colorado.
Legislators present their plan for policing bad cops right to the protesters on the Capitol steps. The officer who posted, "Let's start a riot," is now out of a job.
City leaders have said most of the instigators in these gatherings have come from out of state. 9 Wants to Know looked into the arrest data and a museum's effort to capture history of the protests in real time, even as it cleans up the damage. 9 News at 10 starts now.
We see it again tonight in downtown Denver. If there was any thought that this protest movement in memory of George Floyd and others lost to police brutality was slowing down, it will not be tonight. because the crowds are only gathering in peaceful intensity. In fact, at one point tonight, when somebody set off a firework and there was a bit of a boom, people in the crowd began chanting clearly, "Peaceful protest."
We have not seen any major trouble so far tonight, though police are investigating an incident at 14th and Broadway about 5:30 this evening. Video shows a truck driver arguing with protesters before he drove into the crowd in the crosswalk. Witnesses say no one was hurt.
So as we compare tonight's crowd to last night's crowd, and remember, last night stayed calm on the streets until after midnight, when things went sideways between protesters and police. Tonight's crowd, considerably larger. Always really difficult in these situations with just the aerial pictures to give you firm numbers, but just look with your eyes and see who we have in the streets of Denver tonight versus what we saw last night. Again tonight, very hands-off, laid-back posture by Denver police, allowing protesters a lot of freedom of movement.
His caption read, "Let's start a riot." And today, Denver police gave that officer the boot. Officer Thomas McClay was fired after posting a controversial photo with two other Denver officers dressed in riot gear.
This happened fast. Denver's police chief only announced that he was starting an investigation into the Instagram post yesterday. 9 News reporter Jordan Chavez has been following that as he literally follows protesters through the streets of town tonight. And Jordan, 24 hours is quite the turnaround for a DPD internal investigation.
And it's very different from what we're seeing tonight. Again, as you mentioned, the cops taking up the back end of the protesters, kind of just letting the people that are marching just be. But yes, exactly what you said. This is a very fast turnaround for this investigation. And in fact, we were able to speak with a professor at CU Denver who has done extensive research on this topic as far as police accountability goes. He says this is actually becoming a trend all across the U.S. He says that police chiefs are just starting to move very quickly to act on complaints of misconduct, much like we saw with Officer Thomas McClay, who DPD says violated their social media policy. Now, we looked through the department's codes of conduct, and it specifically addresses these kinds of posts, saying posting images or statements that ridicule any race or protected class of people is prohibited.
Most of the time and historically, police departments have gone through a fairly comprehensive investigative process. And where there are police unions and there are police protections in place, sometimes that can extend for a long period of time. So I think this trend of very quickly acting on issues is fairly new.
Now, you guys, something that the professor also said we need to be very careful about is that we don't allow, just because the police department has fired one person very quickly, for them to not check the rest of the system that they are currently running to make sure that every officer and every personnel, honestly, within that department is also following these codes of conduct, that they are treating people fairly and justly. Now, we are seeing that kind of action tonight, though, again, as police take a very hands-off approach, just following the protesters, letting them be, you guys.
Letting them march through the streets. And we know, Jordan, you'll stay with them and keep us posted. Thank you. And today, the families of several people killed by police in Colorado joined protesters on the steps of the state capitol. They asked the hundreds that gathered to remember their loved ones, too.
Democratic representatives came out of the legislature to announce a sweeping police accountability bill, first to the gathered protesters on the Capitol steps. 9 News reporter Mark Salinger was there for that and has been out at the Capitol throughout the day. And Mark, I guess some protesters are trickling back there.
Yeah, Kyle, like we've heard Jordan talking about, the protesters were marching all throughout Denver, and within the last minute or so, they've all reappeared back here at the Capitol. There's still thousands of people marching peacefully through the streets, and the protest has been peaceful throughout the entire day. Now, earlier today, we heard from the families of some people who were killed by law enforcement in Colorado, and they want the protesters to remember their names as well.
On the sixth day of protests, the names of those killed in Colorado united protesters at the state capitol.
He died in Denver City Jail in 2015.
Natalia Marshall is the niece of Michael Marshall, who died in police custody 5 years ago. The city settled the case with the family, and the 6 deputies involved were never prosecuted.
When I see all these people in support, it's a blessing. It's a true blessing. It's a beautiful sight to see, because I actually feel like maybe they really hear us. Maybe they hear us.
Today, she spoke about her uncle to a crowd protesting the death of George Floyd.
My message to the protesters, the peaceful protesters, is thank you.
And I'm here to say, Black Lives Matter.
The families of 3 black men killed by police in Colorado joined Democratic state lawmakers as they announced a new bill they say will increase police accountability. They say it's designed to increase transparency to police actions across Colorado.
We will, once and for all, strip the immunity that law enforcement has when they kill us.
Representative Leslie Herod says the bill would, among other things, appoint the state attorney general to investigate all instances where someone died at the hands of law enforcement. It would also allow for law enforcement officers who have acted improperly to be sued by eliminating a shield of immunity, as well as require police across the state to wear body cameras.
I hope these police officers are held accountable. It's not fair that the mayor will call these people murderers, but they still go home to their families.
A step Natalia Marshall feels helps address the issue, bringing everyone together today.
I think finally, it's sad to say, but I think finally.
And we reached out to the Colorado Republican Party for their response to the Democratic bill, but did not hear back. Now I want to step out of the shot for a second and paint a picture of what is going on right now. All the protesters that were marching throughout the streets of Denver have now gotten back to the state capitol. Of course, this is past the curfew at 9 p.m., but everything has remained peaceful so far today, and we have not seen any police officers yet engage with any of the protesters here. Again, several thousand protesters still here at 10 p.m. now past the curfew. Kyle?
I was just smiling at the gentleman dancing joyfully in the background of your live shot there. Mark Salinger, thank you very much. Denver Mayor Michael Hancock's spokeswoman is walking back something striking that he said on 9 News late last week. Mayor Hancock's been very quick to call the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota a murder. That is something that Mayor Hancock has not said about controversial use of force deaths in Denver. That is until last Friday, when he made the comment that his office is now trying to backtrack on. I asked him whether some of those local deaths of Michael Marshall, who you heard referenced there, Marvin Booker, and Jesse Hernandez, whether those deaths at the hands of officers in Denver were murder.
Those individuals were, yes, murdered by police officers.
4 days later, the mayor's office says that what Mayor Hancock meant to say to me was that those people were killed by law enforcement and not murdered in the legal sense. We've reached out to the mayor's office to see if he is no longer calling the death of George Floyd a murder. We've not received an answer from the mayor's office on that. Denver City Council and some community activists want a clear explanation from Denver police on when they intend to use force against protesters. Just last night, Police Chief Paul Payson told us that officers would not be using force against protesters who were out peacefully after curfew. And then just an hour later, the police chief said that actually what officers would do is they would use discretion and good judgment as to whether to use force against peaceful protesters. Community activist Elizabeth Epps says officers used neither. She helped write the rules outlining use of force. And then she resigned from the committee today, saying that she had been shot with pepper balls and projectiles during the protests. Epps wants a review of the entire police department.
If your discretion says, there's 3,000 people over here, 4 of them threw a water bottle, let's gas the 3,000 people, you're in the wrong line of work. I'm so embarrassed that I expected better, but I did.
Chief Payson says Internal Affairs will investigate the actions of some of the officers. City Council wants the chief and the director of safety, who the chief reports to come before a council committee to talk about use of force. Councilman Paul Cashman also wants the city's independent monitor to review DPD's policies. Activist and Denver School Board member Tay Anderson wants to take Denver police officers out of schools. He says he's going to work with School Board President Jennifer Bacon on a resolution to end the deal between the schools and DPD. Anderson said he wants nurses and counselors in school instead of officers acting as school resource officers. Anderson says that he and Susanna Cordova, the superintendent, will share more details on Friday morning.
Around the country, local officials have suggested that the outsiders fed the public unrest that followed peaceful protests over the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But Kevin Vaughn from our 9 Wants to Know team dug into the arrests of recent days, and he found that Coloradans dominated the police reports here.
We have individuals, including last night, who are arrested for arson, who are arrested for burglary, who are arrested for creating mischief.
On Saturday, as Denver Police Chief Paul Pazin tried to get his arms around the violent clashes in his city,
We certainly have folks that are coming from outside the metro area in order to further this type of destructive and violent behavior.
he embraced the idea that people from other communities were to blame and promised a crackdown.
We will investigate, follow up, and hold people accountable for the laws that they violate in our community.
And Denver police have done that. 338 arrests so far in 5 nights of trouble. But a 9 Wants to Know analysis found at least 71% of those busted were from Colorado, and the biggest percentage of them were from Denver itself. The vast majority, 290, were accused of minor offenses, like violating curfew or disobeying police. Another 11 were juveniles, and we don't know what they're accused of. But 37 others face more serious charges, including carrying weapons, throwing missiles, assault, and arson. At least 16 of those 37 were from Denver, and another 15 were from other nearby communities, leaving only 6 outsiders. Of course, it's harder to know the hometowns of everyone in the giant crowds filling downtown Denver during the past week, but a majority of the people arrested for causing the worst trouble are right at home. Kevin Vaughn, 9 News.
There are a number of people who have been arrested that we haven't been able to determine a current address for. It's likely, though, that many of them are also locals.
For the first time today, Democratic Governor Jared Polis spoke to reporters about the protests in Colorado that have been going on since last Thursday. The governor criticized President Trump's plan to deploy U.S. troops to American cities.
The president's threat to deploy federal troops is counterproductive, would only stoke the potential for worst violence and destruction. And I fear shows that he's become so isolated in the White House, in the ivory tower, that he doesn't understand what's really going on our streets.
The governor said that he had remained silent through the weekend of protests because he was spending the time listening to faith and community leaders. Governor Polis did call George Floyd's death a murder, part of a pattern of injustice, he said. Another look out live at the protests in downtown Denver tonight, back at the state capitol. And that would appear to be a bunch of people holding up their cell phone flashlights, perhaps. Can't think of anything else that would be. Looks like almost like a concert crowd there in front of the Capitol. A lot of passion tonight. At one point, protesters moved up to 20th and Champa, where they stopped in the street, sitting, kneeling, silent for nearly 9 minutes in recognition of the time that George Floyd spent in Minneapolis with that white officer's knee on his neck. Our coverage of the 6th night of protests in Denver continues after this.
A split screen for you over the city of Denver from Sky 9 and from the ground. You see the protest tonight, 6 nights. And these crowds have, if anything, grown in size compared to yesterday. They are still out there, as we've seen. They've been holding up the lights on their phones, trying to shed a little light at the moment. They've had moments of silence and familiar chants as they speak out against police brutality and fight for justice for all. Interesting because it's been many months since we've seen really much happening in our city because of the pandemic, and this is what we have been watching for nearly a week. And we also saw smaller protests around Denver today, from Castle Rock to Aurora. Aurora's interim police chief, Vanessa Wilson, marched with the protesters today, took a knee. Her department has had its own problems with deaths in police custody, including the most recent case, that one involving the death of Elijah McClain last August. We are witnessing history in real time, and that's why researchers at History Colorado are documenting the current civil unrest in our state, even as their own building is vandalized. Here is the perspective of their CEO, visualized by photojournalist Travis Kachtorian.
We often are saying, it's almost cliche right now, these are unprecedented times.
An emergency curfew order is in place in the city of Denver from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
So History Colorado has, some broken windows. We've got graffiti, a number of things like that around our building. It's since been cleaned up and boarded up, but that's the kind of damage we sustained over the last few nights over the weekend. We don't love being a part of the history, so to speak. We're definitely more recorders of history and interpreters and researchers of history, but we know we can't look at the damage to our building in a vacuum. We know it is part of a much larger story that we all share together.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
We can look at a number of episodes throughout our history to see ways in which people have expanded civil rights, expanded liberties, and it often comes down to times of struggle.
If you refuse to comply, you are subject to immediate arrest.
We're very actively collecting, and we hope collaborating with the community to add to our collection so that we can really tell a very full story of this episode of Colorado history.
A good distance away from the marching and the protests in downtown Denver this week, one band organized its own kind of protest. A group of young jazz musicians put on a concert for people in the Platt Park neighborhood tonight. They said they chose jazz because of its long history with Black musicians. The group used the concert as a way to raise awareness to different organizations where people can donate to support the Black Lives Matter movement.
We could be protesting, but I feel like our music is enough protest for these days that we're living in.
Even though it seems like this isn't protesting against the systemic injustices in this country, it certainly is. It's, that's our message, but we feel that it can be done peacefully and through this music that has such a rich history in our country.
We're all brothers and sisters, and we need to stand together. We can't sit in silence when other people are suffering injustice.
And the band says money raised during the concert will go to the family of George Floyd.
The wind's kicking up here in the 9 backyard, and in spite of the cloud cover today, almost 90 again. I'm tracking isolated severe storms on the far eastern plains tonight. And the clouds, like a work of art over the Colorado sky. Amazing pictures coming in at dawn and dusk. The color, just fantastic. The high today, way above the average of 77, and saw a triple-digit high in southern Colorado. We've got thunderstorms there tonight. A bit of outflow wind moving into the city right now. It's dry and 71. Here in the backyard outside the studios, it's a beautiful evening. The wind's blowing the miller moths out for the moment, so I'll take that. They're everywhere tonight. The thunder showers have predominantly been across the far eastern plains along a front that came in early this morning and brought in that mid and high layer of clouds. clouds. That cloud deck just so persistent all day. We did have a line of storms that produced several land spouts, very weak tornadoes, more like dust devils out around Cheyenne Wells and out across Kit Carson and Cheyenne County. And now we're dealing with just some heavy rainers moving into Nebraska and Kansas. The low headed to the Midwest. The front will stay over northern Colorado tomorrow. We've got tropical moisture coming in around this high pressure area. The flow around it is clockwise. So ingredients are there for thunderstorms, but probably not here in Denver. Storm Prediction Center has the outlook for hail producing storms, extreme northeastern Colorado, North Platte, back into St. Louis and Cincinnati. Temperatures similar to today, mid 80s, the heat building to the west, and that warm air is headed our way. Tonight, these thunder showers will move out. We have another little shower that's building over Fort Collins and Greeley, and then we get a sunny day, less cloud cover, 20% chance of storms tracking from the northwest to the southeast, similar to today. This morning, our low at 63 was a record warm overnight minimum. Not quite that toasty tonight, but still 50s and 60s for lower elevations. Highs tomorrow, 80s for Denver, Greeley, Fort Collins, some 90s on the map down south and out west. Front Range foothill temperatures are warm. Those creeks, streams, and rivers are going to be running high and fast with all the snow melt, so do keep that in mind. Isolated storms moving out, little lightning in the distance, low 59. Sunshine tomorrow, highs 10 degrees warmer than average. A 20% chance of thunderstorms both Wednesday afternoon and Thursday. Perhaps a better chance of rain from storms Friday, and then we turn up the heat for the weekend, 90 Saturday and Sunday. Stop, take time and smell the flowers. Check out the butterflies. Come on now, this guy tells you, just take a moment. Abby says that Teddy says it's a wonderful way to spend the day. The sports is next.
The Broncos held a team meeting today to talk about all that has happened in our country over the past week. Team President Joe Ellis led those meetings. No more room for racism or discrimination of any kind. Plus, the Broncos believe that they can be a part of the healing process, something that safety Kareem Jackson talked about this afternoon.
We have to figure out what we can do, not only as a team, but as a organization. How can we get out and how can we impact the Denver community? You know, how can maybe we can get out and put together a march as a team or something like that. I feel like we have to get out in the community and be heard, you know, just with the opportunities that we have, you know, as professional athletes.
The NFL today told teams that they must stay at their facilities for training camp. Now, the Broncos always practice in our place, but this still affects them because they had the Bears coming in for those preseason practices. That will now not happen. Move to the NBA. The league lost a legend today. Wes Unseld passed away this morning. He was 74 years old. The Hall of Famer has had health issues, mostly pneumonia. Wes Unseld Jr., Wes's son, is a current assistant with the Nuggets. Denver president of basketball operations Tim Conley tweeted out, "As great a player as Wes was, he was a way better person. He made such an incredible impact on so many people. We are thinking of Mrs. Connie, Kim, and Wes Jr. The world has lost a special guy today." Finally, the NBA's Board of Governors has a Thursday meeting to set a vote to finalize the plan to restart their season. A likely model is a 22-team format in Orlando, tipping off July 31st, with the finals ending by October 12th. Stay with us. 9 News returns right after this.